All right, this is The Earth and Its Peoples by Richard Bulliet, Chapter 30, Section 6, The Character of Warfare. So World War II was, and again, we're talking about World War II. World War II was the deadliest war that had ever been fought. 60 million people died. Of the 60 million people who died, civilian deaths or civilian victims outnumbered, combat deaths, or those who were soldiers. And that was something that really had never been the case when it came to at least modern warfare. It should also be noted that many of these civilian victims, not only did they outnumber combat victims, they were intentionally, right? There was an intention on all parties to kill civilians. This occurred in many different ways, ranging from massacres, which occurred in occupied territories, famines, the general disruption due to warfare. This was also true of places that were sieged up. Think of Leningrad in the Soviet Union, and aerial bombing. The technology allowed for bombs to be dropped on civilians. Of the participating nations, the Soviet Union suffered the most casualties. China was the second. Both of these nations were occupied. What was true about civilian victims was, all sides participated in the intentional targeting of civilians. Initially, during the beginning of the war, it was Allied powers, the Soviet Union, China, Britain, France. But towards the end of the war, Axis powers, Germany, Italy, and Japan, experienced wars being fought in their nations. And where at the start of the war, the Axis were the occupiers, during the ending phases of the war, the Axis powers were the occupied, and German civilians, Italian, Japanese civilians were killed as well. One thing that's not talked really all that much is the number of refugees. Millions lost homes and were forced to migrate as a result of the war. So of the 60 million who were killed, many more millions of people were created or were refugees from the war, looking for new places to live. The sheer devastation of World War II is really, you can't emphasize it enough. It was an incredibly destructive war, not just in the people who were killed, but also the property and disruption to things like infrastructure. One thing that was true about the war is that it was a major catalyst of technological change. Technology played a big role in World War II. The invention of radar, or the use of radar, by Britain helped defeat Germany. Medical technologies such as antibiotics led to less death due to disease, or infection. This ultimately led to more improved health in the long run. It was created to help out soldiers, but of course was passed on antibiotics to the rest of the population afterwards. A huge jump in aircraft technology. During the war, we talked about it last section, 30.5, the character of warfare in World War II. Aviation was incredibly important, and so there was a huge transition from things like heavy bombers, big airplanes that could carry more bombs. Really was the goal of all sides. So the bigger the airplane, the more bombs that an airplane could carry, and therefore the more damage it could do. So a huge arms race in that technology. Germany experimented with jet technology, using jet propulsion as opposed to a propeller. And eventually Germany also used V2 missiles, which was, essentially unmanned bombs, right? Why risk flying an airplane over when one can simply invent a missile? And of course, missile technology only further improves after the war was over, but huge jumps in this. And just to give you kind of an idea of just how much a catalyst World War II was in aviation technology, the very first airplane was invented, I think, 1902 or something like that. I may be getting the date wrong, but by 1969, the United States is landing the first man on the moon. So in less than 70 years, you go from the invention of the airplane essentially to space travel, exploration, and visiting places like the moon. So very, very dramatic. And of course, weapon technology was a major catalyst for World War II. Atomic weapons, right? This was using atomic energy to create a bomb like the world had never seen before, and much like aviation technology only continues to accelerate, right? There was a lot of different weapons invented, but atomic weapons were probably the most destructive or most significant to come out of the Second World War. Now, we mentioned aerial bombing was, certainly one aspect of the Second World War. Morale bombing of civilians was done. That is essentially to target civilians to crush the spirit. Now, it was true that the priority in many cases was, economic. So, for example, the United States, when it carried out bombing missions against Japan, targeted Japanese industries. At least that was the idea. Same thing was true initially for German bombers in Great Britain, British bombers in Germany. But during the course of the war, all sides intentionally targeted civilians, highly populated civilian areas, for the purpose of trying to crush the spirit. This turned out to be ineffective in the long run, really for all participating nations. Whereas it only strengthened the resolve of those particular nations. Examples include both Dresden and Tokyo. These just happen to be two Axis cities. So this was a German city bombed by the Allies. Civilian deaths there. And of course, Tokyo, Japanese city, bombed by the US. But you could say the same thing about a city like London, for example. London was the target of German bombs, specifically targeting civilians there. Now, of course, civilians were, fair game, intentionally targeted, but it was the country of Germany which executed a policy of extermination, and this was unique to the Nazis. The Holocaust is the Nazi effort to systematically murder the European Jewish population. And it was unlike a lot of other civilian deaths during the course of World War II in that, number one, it wasn't simply a byproduct of casualties of war. Oftentimes the line between civilian and soldier was blurred, and that resulted in a lot of civilian deaths. And it wasn't the intentional bombing of other nations. The Holocaust was the campaign of Nazi Germany to rid Europe of its Jewish population. Initially, the Holocaust, we talked a little bit about the Nuremberg laws and the types of ways that Germany discriminated against their Jewish population, stripped Jews of their citizenship, put them in concentration camps or prisons, identified them with specific patches, the Star of David. But when the Nazis came to expand their territory into places like Poland and the Soviet Union, many more Jews came under the occupation of Nazi Germany. It was always a goal of the Nazis to rid Europe of its Jewish population, and World War II provided the context for this systematic murder to take place. Initially, Jews were forced into ghettos. These were essentially walled-off cities. Walled-off cities in which people starved to death and died of disease. The final solution came in 1942, and that was the construction of extermination camps where thousands, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people were put on trains, sent specifically to extermination camps. These were designed to kill people in mass and poisoned with poison gas. The Holocaust, as it's called, resulted in the killing of 6 million Jews. And more, including homosexuals, Polish Catholics, gypsies, other people who the Nazis deemed to be unfit. Auschwitz was probably the most notorious of these camps. Auschwitz was both a death and labor camp, with those who were healthy forced to perform slave labor. The elderly, children, they were typically sentenced to death and systematically murdered. The Holocaust initially, at the onset of the war, was not something that took place overnight. It was something that had a gradual sort of unfolding, you might say. And it was in the guise of World War II, specifically in the later years, 1942, when Germany was losing the war, that the Nazi regime and others in Germany went through with this, and becomes a major catalyst of change after the war, right after World War II. There were atrocities that were committed in other countries, but nothing quite as systematic as what the and brutal as what the Nazis did in Europe. Meanwhile, when we talk about the home front, it really doesn't exist in World War II. So the home front in many nations was the war front. Remember, this was a war of occupation, and pretty much every single participating nation in World War II was occupied by an enemy army at one point or another. The exception here is the United States. In the United States, World War II is often seen as the good war because it had kind of a different impact in the US as it did around the world. No bombs were dropped on American cities. The exception, we might say, is Pearl Harbor, but this really wasn't a civilian target. Really no civilian deaths when compared to other nations. And at home, the war was an economic boom, right? It really ended the Great Depression in the United States. And so for that, and of course, probably the most important part of that was that the US was on the winning side of World War II. And for that particular reason, it's typically seen as the good war. It meant more job opportunities, specifically for women and minorities. In some cases, World War II helped to break racial and gender barriers, right? Whereas in other nations, World War II was remembered much more for the amount of civilian deaths, conscripted slave labor that civilians were subject to. And, for that reason, in the United States, it gets tended to remember a little bit differently than it does around the world. One last point that your textbook talks about: war and the environment during the Depression years. The environment was generally doing good because there was less consumption of resources during the war years. Destruction to the environment was pretty bad.